Maybe no, I started asking the question. Okay. You could probably hear me anyway. What are the regional and international challenges the EU and Australia can address together, and how can this be done? Has the Australian membership in the UN Security Council changed the Australian foreign policy outlook, and has it improved the potential for future EU-Australian cooperation on foreign and security policy? That's a more specific question.
Many thanks, and I think I can just neatly follow up to what Bruno said on the threat perceptions and also on shared interests. And I think you start very well to define those. I can maybe even be a bit more specific. If we talk about counter-piracy, if we talk about counter-terrorism, if we talk about organized crime, so maybe not the geostrategic interest, to which I will come in a second, because they are also there. We find an increasing, not only overlap or realization of joint interests. They don't move around, it just, we come more to understand that we have them together and come actually to the conclusion we address them together. Let me go one after the other. Counter-piracy with this new government now that speaks more about the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific. From Perth you can almost see the Horn of Africa, it's quite a way, but actually it's the other side of the ocean. But the joint interest in having free trade routes that go from Japan through the South China Sea, so the East China Sea first, and the South China Sea around India, then passing by the Horn of Africa, and then towards Europe, is blatantly obvious, but so far it hasn't resulted in much cooperation. We're getting there, we're moving there now, and the crisis management agreement we're about to sign will also lead to increased cooperation. We will see, most likely, it's not done and dusted yet, but we will see most likely the first contribution of Australia to an EU-led civilian crisis management mission at the Horn of Africa. This is just a kind of a manifestation of that we see more and more together what we can do together. Now, moving to the next one, transnational crime, organized crime. We actually have already an agreement in EU languages, the PNR agreement, passenger name records. Sounds more innocent than it is. In the EU, very politicized about how you can give to a third country the information that you retrieve from flight bookings. But after the first 2 years in action, we have been talking to the security agencies here in Australia, and what it does is, because the flights from Europe to here are so long, it gives the security agencies the time they need to get ready if somebody who is suspicious and who has been identified on the basis of this data to be arrested. And they say it's mainly in the area of drug smuggling they have been successful so far, but it can easily be moved to further areas. So even there, a realization of joint interests, of shared interests, but beyond that, a moving on towards concrete cooperation. Counterterrorism, maybe the next one, and we have, each of us has a bit of a specialized expertise. Australia more in Southeast Asia, there are a few people who know more about terrorist activities in Indonesia, for example, than the Australian services, while the EU has more knowledge about terrorist activities in Northern Africa and the Middle East. With the phenomenon of foreign fighters getting more and more concrete, foreign fighters being, for example, Australians who discover that they want to engage in the jihad for some reason, travel to Syria, come back with a set of skills that you rather wouldn't want to have them. The exchange of information of how to deal with this, how to deal with counter-radicalization, where, for example, the Sydney police or the Melbourne police is very good at. This we engage in very concrete cooperation with the Australian authorities, which is far below the big rhetoric of inter-regional relations and all this, but is addressing jointly identified threats and interests together. If I just move quickly to the bigger geostrategic threats and interests, Iran, We have seen, now the EU has been very engaged in dealing with the negotiations on the nuclear issue and ways to prohibit Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. As part of that, there is a very close cooperation with Australia on sanctions. You might know the US and the EU have instigated autonomous sanctions to well, lead the way of Iran to come back to the negotiating table, but they didn't do this alone. They did it together with Japan, they did it together with South Korea, but also with Australia. On rather sensitive issues, if you start blocking somebody's petrochemical exports, you're into deep trouble. And Australia, after very intense kind of consultations with us, with the Americans, has taken these steps. So on big issues, the like-mindedness is not so far away. And that is real kind of big stuff. Now Ukraine, the most recent case, it didn't take very long after the EU and the US came out with their decisions on sanctions and their way of reacting towards the Russian occupation of Crimea, that Foreign Minister Bishop issued a statement, and the government of Australia also decided to sanction Russia and Ukrainian individuals. So you can see on a quite broad variety of things where we actually get together, acting quite quickly together, and now arguably you can say, well, Ukraine is quite away from here, but you see the like-mindedness in the action. Maybe just one word on the Anglosphere, because this is a funny concept that I've never come to understand, because if it's beyond the Five Eyes, maybe, then is it covering India? Is it covering Sri Lanka? Is it kind of the old Commonwealth just rewrapped? For me, it's a very old concept, and even the UK is not. They use the G7 now to kind of advocate, but G7, while a lot of them speak English, it's not a pure Anglosphere club. It's a catchy phrase, but I've never seen kind of this turning into an operational reality. And there, while it's always nice to have a debate and an argument about it, I prefer to look at actually what the executives do together, act together, and there we can see quite a step change in addressing common challenges together. It doesn't mean that all is nice and happy, but it's there's quite a lot going on.
Well, it's a perfect transition for the next questions, which are on the UK, the EU, and Australia, and Ben is our expert here, so we'll have to answer a lot of these questions. What debate has there been in Australia about the UK's relations with the EU? What impact will a UK withdrawal from the EU have on Australia's relations with the UK? That's a kind of provocative question here. What impact will Britain's withdrawal have on Australia's relation with the rest of the EU? That's the question. And what approach do you think the Australian government would like to see the UK take toward the EU?
Okay, thank you. And well, look, some of the stuff about the historic relations we've covered already, so I think we can leave that. In terms of the Australian government's attitude, and I'm saying that in plural, right, government's attitude towards the EU, where I was directed in researching for this talk was to the UK's balance of competencies review, right, which is a very parliamentary jargonistic way of saying that in Britain, and this is the kind of political context that I'm trying to tease out here, is that currently the EU is being reviewed by the British government, right? And the British government, led with the Conservative Party in the majority, is trying to say, well, what parts of EU activity should be returned, or competencies should be returned to Westminster, right? So the attitude in the United Kingdom at the moment towards the EU is hostile, I would say. Only recently, in the last few months, have organisations and tentatively the media, and to some extent the Labour Party, started coming out and saying, actually, maybe membership of the EU would be kind of okay. It's to do with the political debate and the nature of the political debate, which has been highly dominated by a Eurosceptic press, a Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party, which has done, if you like, a far better job, although it's a minority in the party, has done a far better job of promoting its critique in the public realm than supporters of the EU have been. And ever since the problems with the euro, it seemed to have vindicated, decisions of Labour and Conservative governments not to join the EU, the eurozone, right? So the atmosphere and the context is very negative towards the EU and the UK at the moment. Now, the Australian government's attitude to that, we talked about, Katrina, you mentioned that the Labour Party's more multilateral focus, and I think that's correct. The Australian government on Valentine's Day last year put in a submission to this balance of competences review that said, we like Britain, we like the EU, we do appreciate the way that Britain has seen to reform EU from the inside, make it more globalised, open, more neoliberal would be another way of putting that. We said, don't leave, right? Don't pull out. Which is the kind of thing that's in play at the moment. So that's the official position, which I don't think has changed since the incoming government. But let's go back to this thing called the Anglosphere. You're right, it's kind of a fantasy, right? It is a sort of political fantasy, and it does the rounds in right-wing think tanks in the United States, in Australia, in Britain, and it's at the stage of, it has support from conviction politicians. There's a couple of conferences in Britain and America in 1999 and 2000, featuring people like Margaret Thatcher, who are in a position where they can kind of like speak more freely than they were able to as statespeople. But it's not clear if it includes Singapore. It's not clear if it includes India. There is a kind of a core, 5 states: Canada, US, Britain, Australia, New Zealand. It's maybe totally unrealistic. However, what it allows in each of its different places is a critique of the EU. And that's where I think the danger of the concept lies for, in particular, Australia, UK, EU relations. Maybe Julie Bishop's visit only to London was designed for a UK audience consumption, but that's maybe one way of explaining it. Right? There would be a need to meet that audience's expectations in a diplomatic visit. So I think that what impact might this have? Well, I think that there is a positioning in Australia to realise that the UK is not the only way, means of engaging with the EU. You notice that the last EABC trade delegation did not go to London, it went to only eurozone countries. So that might be an opposite message being sent. On the other hand, I think a potential British withdrawal, and we're only talking potential here, there might be some schadenfreude on the right of Australian politics that, it was never going to work. It's not natural, it's not an organic community, it doesn't fit together very well. And I think that you might get that, but the EU is seen here in Australia, despite an irritant, and I think that possibly subsidies will become an issue again when you look at the Abbott government's attitudes to subsidies in Australia. They don't like them at all. But I think that there are other ways of relating to the EU, but the UK is seen as the gateway to Europe, in terms of investment and so on. And there will be need to a little bit of reaccommodation of mental worldviews in Australia if such things should happen.
Thank you, Ben, for asking all these questions in a very succinct way. I turn to the next challenge, the eurozone crisis and its impact on Australia. And these questions are for Remy, Davison, Bruno, Scholl, and Benvenuti again. So what has been the impact of the eurozone crisis in the region? How is the recovery of the eurozone economy changing the dynamics in the G20 under Australian chairmanship? And we go back then to Ben here. What are the British aims to reform the EU and how can relations between the eurozone and the rest of the EU be managed?
I'm happy to defer to Remy.
Okay, then maybe would Remy start on this first?
I'll start.
You want to speak on the podium?
Stand up because my leg's falling asleep. Thanks very much, Pascaline. And since we are actually talking about long-term relationships, I worked out the other day that Philo and I have known each other for 25 years. I was only about as tall as Andrea is now. Sorry. We are talking about the 1950s, aren't we? Things like that. And of course, because of that, Philo and I had a lot of disagreements over that period. And it hasn't ended today. I was just interested, actually, sort of when you said that we have a realist government now. I'm just wondering which of our governments was a realist. Apart from Gough, perhaps. But we all know, of course, Kevin Rudd described himself as a brutal realist, particularly in relation to China, but he used other choice words as well. The other thing just has come up just before I answer the question that Pascaline has posed is when I was up in Canberra in 2008, which was just after the Rudd government was elected, and Ben was there as well, of course, I spoke to a lot of diplomats from the European Union, and the one thing that they all told me was how they hated John Howard so much, and loved Kevin Rudd so much, because they saw Howard as bringing Australia, and I'm not making a comment on this, I mean governments do what governments think they should do, so I'm not making a left-right or favour-liberal comment here, but that Howard was seen as very much falling into what Ben and Bruno have been talking about. I mean, this idea of the Anglosphere, of dragging Australia away from the good international citizenship that it spent a lot of resources developing during the Hawke-Keating years, and that Howard, particularly as a result of the Iraq War, and also the Downer and Howard refusing to sign the framework agreement, wasn't it, in 1997, because Australia wouldn't sign the human rights clause, that they had undone a lot of good work of previous governments, but that Rudd was seen as a vigorous multilateralist. I'm not sure that actually turned out to be true in the end. And I think Rudd remained, like most Australian governments have been since Hawke, primarily focused on Asia and the Asia-Pacific region and mostly on China, of course. Now, Pascaline, of course, did ask a question. I sent a few questions to Pascaline, but I had probably been drinking important French champagne and or Veuve Clicquot and eating broiled swan at the time, so I don't quite remember what I said. But one of the things did relate to the impact of the eurozone, and I think some of our commentators have already said how I think the current government and perhaps the previous Labor government were not too au fait with what was really going on there and how there might be an impact upon Australia. Well, there were impacts upon Australia, and there are likely problems that we face in the future as well. Just to begin with, as Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens said not very long ago, one of the things which has affected the Australian economy and will continue to affect the Australian economy in the near and medium-term future is the fact that the United States and the European Union, via the European Central Bank, have run extraordinary, as he put it, extraordinary monetary policies that we have not seen in most of our lifetime, certainly probably nobody in this room. The fact that the United States and the ECB have run interest rates to close to zero has meant that Australia has been running higher interest rates than the rest of the world. So it's made Australia, in some ways, yes, a destination for foreign investment, it's made it a destination for the carry trade, but it's also meant that it's given our own central bank relative restrictions on how far it can move if it has to reflate the economy. As we saw during the global financial crisis, the Rudd government had to engage in substantial borrowing and deficit spending in order to pump prime, to stimulate the Australian economy. Now, if we look at what was occurring a bit after that, because of course the eurozone crisis really began to come about in 2011, 2012, when it looked to many commentators, as it turned out quite incorrectly, that the eurozone was going to collapse. It was going to fail. Greece was going to exit the eurozone. That was in 2011, 2012. There was even a prediction from a major bank that just sell your euros, because I guarantee you, this was the statement sent to clients in mid-2012, I guarantee you Greece will leave the eurozone on the 1st of January 2013 and reintroduce the drachma. We're still waiting. The demand falls in the EU economy in 2011-12 were substantial, and most importantly, of course, they affected China. China sends about 17% of its exports to the United States and 16% to the EU. Now, those figures are pessimistic. They're pessimistic because they don't always count, and sometimes it's double counted, it's very complex, the Hong Kong and Taiwan trade. So China is heavily dependent upon affluent consumer markets to keep that marvellous growth going. And as we know, because of the long-run recession in the United States and in Europe, the double-dip recession in Britain, just to give you another example, in Italy alone, which is a big, big consumer market, demand in 11-12 for Chinese products fell 18% in Italy. So as a consequence of this, there cannot be anything but a flow-on effect for the Australian economy. And the other problem with this, of course, is that it's meant that on the investment side of the ledger, that there have been falls in European investment in Australia. And I always like to ask a little quiz. I'll ask some of my former students not to answer this one. But you probably, if I ask you who the biggest foreign investor in Australia is, you're probably going to say, anybody?
China.
No! You've been wrong. I'm so glad you said that because it's so wrong. Because China comes about 12th in terms of foreign investment. Hong Kong on its own is much bigger than China. So we're not dependent on Chinese investment, we are dependent upon American investment. We are heavily dependent, as you would expect. The UK has a huge net stock of foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. That is investment on the Australian stock market. That is investment in all our pension funds. Even tiny little Switzerland is bigger than Hong Kong in terms of the investment in Australia. The Netherlands is bigger than Switzerland again, so I'll give you the figures actually. As of 2011, the Netherlands invests over 43 billion in total stock investment in Australia. China's total stock investment in that year from the mainland was 19 billion. So China is not a big foreign investor. It has grown very fast in the last 6 or 7 years, but it hasn't actually become one of those big investors in Australia, despite what we hear about the housing market and agribusiness and so on. But having said that, the eurozone crisis meant that European corporations did begin to, in order to increase their liquidity, begin to pull investments out of Australia. Now this happened in the 1990-91 recession in Australia, when Japanese firms started pulling money out of Australia. Similarly, for example, just one major firm, the Banque Nationale de Paris, pulled out around 8 or 9 billion from the Australian economy as a result of the global financial crisis. The other thing is that what you pay for in terms of your interest rates on your credit cards, in terms of your mortgages, or anything else that you use credit for, Australian banks have to go out and seek capital primarily on European markets. Australian banks were not heavily exposed to the eurozone crisis. However, what they do is that they go and compete with other banks, American banks, Hong Kong banks, and so on, so Japanese banks, and so on. They compete for global finance. As a consequence of that, Australia and Australians and Australian business, perhaps more importantly, are paying much higher interest rates, much more for the cost of capital. So that means that everything in Australia, as I think everybody has worked out by now, whether a resident or a tourist, costs an awful lot. High wages, high cost of capital, high cost of doing business, high cost of borrowing, high cost of housing. So there have been some direct effects as a result of Australia on Australia, on the eurozone. The other thing more broadly, and I'll finish up and give the floor to others in a moment, is that not just China, but of course the whole Asian region has been affected to some extent or another. I'm still doing some research in this area for a paper in a month or so in relation to how much impact the eurozone crisis has had over the last 4 or 5 years upon the Asian region in terms of the downturn in demand and therefore deflating and to some extent depressing the world economy. But so far the results suggest that it's quite significant.